So let's go in the API help now, and I want to talk about the ways in which we could create a new drawing. There is an API call called new document, which you probably would have ran into if you just typed in the document keyword and then looked for new. You would have run into this, and basically this will let us create a new document based on a specified template. So you might think, all right, great idea. I'll just input the template I want to use, and since we're creating a drawing, we can also input the paper size, width, height, and the result is we get the iModelDoc2 interface returned. So we'll be able to interact with that new drawing document. However, in the case of this macro, I don't want to go this route, because if we do this, it's not automatically going to add in a sheet format. And in order to add in a sheet format, I'm going to have to go down not an incredibly complicated route, but just a route that I don't really want to pursue right now in such a short series. Basically, we would have to end up using setup sheet 5 in order to actually set up the sheet. And as you can see, that contains a lot of arguments where we specify the paper size, the template, the scale, whether we want first or third angle, and all kinds of other things. If you want to try on your own to use this in combination with SOLIDWORKS new document, go right ahead. But for the purposes of this video series, instead what we're going to do is I'm just going to utilize this pre-made blank drawing that I already have with the files related to this series. So as you can see, just a blank drawing already has a sheet format included in it. And so what we're going to do, instead of creating a brand new document, is just open up this document and add in the views and then dimension the views. So let's go ahead and close out of this, and I'll show you how to open that document. Let's go over here again to the index, and we'll type in document and we'll look for open. And when we double click on this, we're going to get a pretty big list. So there's quite a lot of API calls related to opening documents, as you would imagine. And in fact, it's more common to open an existing document than a new one, so it's definitely beneficial to understand what I'm about to show you. But eventually you're going to run into these API calls, OpenDoc6 and OpenDoc7. Let's go ahead and double click on OpenDoc7. So actually, I'll also type it in here, OpenDoc7, and scroll up a little bit. So this is the most recent version of the API call that lets you open an existing document. And notice there's been several versions. And this is a good example of an API call that's more complicated than I really need it to be. So in the case of OpenDoc7, what we actually have to do is specify a separate object, which is called a specification object, or in this case it's iDocument specification. We basically have to create this object. We have to change a lot of its properties to get exactly what we want, and then input it into this API call. And long story short, it's just too complicated. It's more than we need 99% of the time. So instead, I'm just going to jump back to OpenDoc6, which was actually in that list you saw earlier when we were browsing by topic. And this simply has 6 arguments, and 2 of them are output arguments. So again, they are arguments that come back to us if there's an error or a warning. So anyway, let's actually go down in the parameters list and take a closer look. The first parameter is the file name, so the document name or full path, if not in the current directory, including extension. So I always, just as a rule of thumb, I always specify the full path. And then the document type, so you have to specify what you're trying to open. In our case, we'll be opening a drawing, so we're going to use this SWDoc drawing enumeration member. And then there is options, and if we go into options, again, we have some options like when we were saving our part earlier. We have the option to open it silently. So this is the only option I'm going to use in here. We'll use the open silently option. And then you can also specify a configuration to be opened with the document. In our case, we're not really worried about that since this is a drawing. So we're actually just going to specify empty. And then again, errors and warnings spit something back out to us. And then the return value is the newly loaded model document. So that's the iModel.2 interface. So once we get that, we'll take our SW model variable and we'll set that equal to this new drawing document. So how do we actually use OpenDoc6? Well, let's go back here, and again, the first thing we need is this full path, so let's make sure we know what that is. If I go into this folder, which has the drawing in it, we see that it is in C drive files, and then it's called drawing.sld_drw. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and now let's go back into our code, and what I'm going to do is move down here, and I'll say open drawing. And then I'm going to create a variable, string variable, and I'll say dim str draw path as string, and I'm going to set that equal to C drive files, and then paste in the drawing name. And now I'm just going to use this variable as the first argument in OpenDoc6. So let's say set SW model equals, and again, notice that we're reusing our SW model variable. If we wanted, we could have created a new iModel.2 object variable to keep the part and the drawing iModel.2 variables separate, but really for our purposes it's not going to make a difference, so we'll just reuse it. And then I'll say swap.opendoc6, and again, OpenDoc6 resides in ISLDWorks, so that's why we said swap.opendoc6, and since we are returning a value from this method, we're going to put the arguments in parentheses. And so the first argument is the file name. So let's type in strdrawPath. And then for type as long, let's go back into the API help. Let's grab the type out of here. It's going to be swdocDrawing. Paste that in. Then options as long. And you remember that we're going to use that silent option. Well, you might be tempted to just go up here and grab this one and copy it down here. Well, notice that this says save as option, so it's actually not the exact same enumeration member that we need. We need the one that pertains to OpenDoc. So we're going to come in here, grab this, it says OpenDoc options, paste that in. Next up, the configuration we want, which we don't care about since we're in a drawing, so I'll say empty, and then I'm going to use my underscore to wrap to the next line, and for errors and warnings, I'm also going to put in empty. And again, if you thought there was going to be issues, you could return those values and take a look at them, but in our case, I'm pretty sure this is going to work just fine. So let's put on that closing parentheses and go to the next line. So now at this point we have opened up this existing drawing. It already has the sheet format in it. That's good. So now let's add in this standard 3-view layout. So let's go into the API help, and what I'll do is I'll search by topic. So I'm just going to type in drawing views, and there's a pretty large section for drawing views. Notice that the interface is simply iView, so that corresponds to drawing views. And as we move through here, eventually you'll run into standard 3 views. So let's double click on this, and here we have two methods: create first angle views to and create third angle views to. Well, if you're in Europe, it's very possible that you use first angle views, and if you're in North America, or namely the United States, you probably use create third angle. So since I'm in the US, I'll go ahead and double click on this, and it says create standard 3 orthographic views with third angle projection for the specified model. So sounds like exactly what we need. And notice it is in this interface called iDrawingDoc. Now, do we have access right now to iDrawingDoc? No, we don't. So I'm going to show you in a moment how we get access to that. But for now, let's just go down and take a look at the parameters. Only one parameter, surprisingly, and it is simply the name of the document from which to create views. And that's a little misleading because what it wants is the full path to the part or the component from which we're going to create the views. So again, we're going to have to do some working with strings in order to get the model path. And then the return value is true if successful, false if not. We're not going to worry about getting the return value in this case. So our first concern is, how do we get access to this iDrawing doc? Well, let's click up here to iDrawing doc interface, and it says allows access to functions that perform drawing operations. So now we're going to move from iModel Doc 2 down into iDrawing doc. So again, think back to that SOLIDWORKS API Object hierarchy. We started up at the very top with SOLIDWORKS, then we moved down to iModel Doc 2. Now we're getting even more specific. We're going down to iDrawing doc, and let's go down to the bottom of this page to see the accessors list. And notice there is no accessors list. So that's kind of odd. How are we supposed to get this interface then if there's no accessors? Well, this is an exception. iDrawing doc, iAssembly doc, and iPart doc are all exceptions to the accessor rule. Normally you would look for a method or property that is called an accessor, and then you can go right on using that interface and its members. But in the case of those three interfaces I just mentioned, instead, we're going to have to do something a little different, and the easiest way to find out what that is to just click on one of the examples here. So make sure it's VBA, and I'll just do this one, activate each view on current sheet. So let's scroll down and notice that they have declared their application variable, model variable, and then there's their drawing doc interface variable. So that's good, that's making sense thus far. Now let's go down and see how they set these variables. So this we're familiar with, we already did that. This we already did. Now to get the iDrawing doc interface, all they did was set it equal to SW model. Well, that's interesting. Does that mean that iDrawing doc is actually the same thing as iModel Doc 2? No, but what is happening here is something that's called interface inheritance. So iDrawing doc is able to inherit some of iModel Doc 2. And then that lets us keep on moving right along with our functionality that's specific to iDrawing doc. So if that didn't make a lot of sense, don't worry. All you need to know is that whenever you need to get iPart doc, iAssembly doc, or iDrawing doc, all you have to do is set your variable for those equal to SW model. And then you can go right on using SWDraw, if you call it, to use members within iDrawing doc. So let's try that out right now. Let's go back to our code and we'll say set SWDraw, and I'll declare that in a moment, equals SWModel. And let's come back up here and we'll say dim SWDraw as SOLIDWORKS drawing doc. So now if I come down here and I type in, let's type in SWModel again. Right here's my list for all the members within iModel Doc 2. But if I change this to draw, notice it's a different list. It's a list of all the members available in iDrawing doc. So now the method we're trying to use, don't forget, if we go back, is ultimately this create third angle views 2. So let's go ahead and put this on a line further down, and we'll say create drawing views, and then we'll say swdraw dot create third angle views 2, and don't forget that we need the model name as string. So kind of like with what we did up here, if we wanted, we could just go into this folder, figure out what the path is to support.sldprt, and we could create a new string variable for it and all that. But I actually want to show you a workaround, something that'll be a little bit simpler and allow us to include one less assumption in this macro. And what do I mean by assumption? Well, for example, back up here we made an assumption. When you run this macro, it's going to assume that you have a drawing file called drawing.sld_drw in a folder called files on your C drive. Is that a good assumption? Well, I don't know. It depends on the macro you're writing, and it depends on who you're writing it for. But if you can ever remove an assumption, generally it's going to make your macro a little bit more stable. So in our case, let's assume that we don't know where that original support.sldprt is going to be, and instead, when we're up here adding the configuration and all that, we simply want to get the current path and then use it down here. So what we're going to do is, before we open the drawing and before we get this newly opened drawing document, which we use to replace our current SW model, let's do this. Let's put in a comment first that says get the model path. And I'm going to create a variable, and I'll call it str model path as string. So again, this is the model path of support.sldprt. And let's say str model path equals, and I'm just going to type it right in, model.get path name. So this is a really cool API call that if I type it in the API help real quick, you'll see that it gets the full path name for this document, including the file name and the file extension. And also notice down here it says if the document has not yet been saved, then the string is empty, and that makes sense. But in our case, we can assume that the part will be saved, so this should work out just fine. So that's going to get the full path, put it in there, and then down here we can use str model path. And I just want to reiterate that if for whatever reason you decided to say SW model get path name down here and skip that whole step of declaring a new variable and whatnot, since SW model has been changed up here to be equal to the drawing document, right here you would be getting basically this path name. So we don't want to do that, and that's why we want to use iModel.doc2 get path name before we change what SW model is pointing to. So again, let's just grab this and we'll put it back in there like the way we had it. So at this point, let's actually run the macro from where it is now. We'll go ahead and save it, and then go back to SOLIDWORKS, make sure everything's okay, make sure our support part is up. And let's go ahead and run this. And if we go back there, we see that indeed the third angle projection standard views were added. So next up on the list is to add the model dimensions, and that's basically going to be the equivalent of insert model items. So basically we need to look for an API call that mimics insert model items. So as always, we need to figure out what API call we need. And if you wanted, you could probably try using the macro recorder here and then just record yourself inserting model items. But again, I want to keep you focused on the API help and how to use the API help. Well, let's try to find it in the API help. What you might have done is you might have gone up to the index tab, typed in dimension, and then double-clicked on add. But as you look through here, you would see a lot of different methods that correspond to just manually adding dimensions, but nothing related to insert model items. So no matter, you'd click cancel, and maybe you'd come down here and you'd see drawing views. So you double click on drawing views, and you'd look through here, and still you wouldn't run into anything very useful. So what do you do then? Do you just immediately go to the macro recorder? Well, no, let's think about the name, insert model items. Let's just try typing in insert model, and notice there's nothing for insert model items, so let's go back and just leave it at insert model. And notice that there is insert model annotations 3, and notice it belongs to iDrawingDoc, and there's also insert model dimensions, and that also belongs to iDrawingDoc. So maybe one of these does something similar to insert model items. The question is which one to use. Well, let's try double clicking on this one. It says inserts model annotations into this drawing document in the currently selected drawing view. Well, that sounds like insert model items, because we know that items or dimensions are a type of annotation. Now let's go look at this one. This one seems to be pretty much the same thing, except there's fewer options. So which one should we use? Should we go with this one just because it's simpler? Well, even though we could use this one, the reason I want to use insert model annotations 3 is because if we move down here to parameters, not only are we going to have a few more useful options to work with in terms of the source of the dimensions and also whether to remove duplicates, things like that, but it's this last parameter I'm really interested in. It says true to insert dimensions as they were placed in Sketch, false to not. Even though it's kind of hard to tell from this API help description, This parameter is basically the same thing as auto-align dimensions, and if we set this to false, it's actually going to give us a pretty nice layout for our dimensions so the user doesn't have to go and rearrange them manually afterward. He or she might have to a little bit, but this will definitely get them started and help them out quite a bit. Oh, and one other thing I want to note, this third argument, it also says true to insert the annotations in all views in the drawing, false only for the selected view. So even though the description up at the top only mentions the currently selected view, we actually have the option to just select one of the drawing views and then set this to true, and it will insert dimensions for all of them. So I like that a lot as well, and overall I think you can see why this is a superior method to this one over here. But again, it takes a little bit of research. So as I mentioned before, this method belongs to iDrawingDoc, and the million-dollar question is always, do I have access to that interface? And in our case, we do. So now let's go back to our code and start working with this. I'll move down here and we'll say insert model dimensions. And so what I'm going to do is just say swdraw dot, and notice I'm not utilizing any return value, even though if you want you can get an array of all of the annotations you've created, but arrays are well beyond what I want to cover in this series, so we're not going to worry about that for now. But we'll look for insert model annotations 3, and now for the first option, let's go back to the API help and see what's available. Source of dimensions as defined here, and let's grab this from the entire model and paste it in there, and I'm going to put in a comma, and for types as long, let's go back to the API help again. So types, bitwise or basically means we can add them together if we want to get a combination of options if we so desire. And the only one I'm going to use here is insert dimensions marked for drawing. So let's come back here and notice that this line is getting kind of long, so I'm going to put in the underscore, wrap it around, and we'll move on to all views, and we do want true for all views. And then for duplicate dimensions, do we want those removed? Yes, I'll say true. And then hidden feature dimensions, I forget what this is exactly, so let's go back here. And true to insert dimensions from features that are hidden, and false to not. So I'm going to say false there. And then for use placement in Sketch, this is where I said that you want to include false if you want it to do some automatic alignment. So with that, let's test this out. Let's go back to our part. Well, we have a drawing open right now. Let's go ahead and exit out of this so we're back to where we were. And I'm going to, oh, it already saved it. And I don't like that because now I'm going to have to go back to the original configuration, delete this out, resave it. What I'm going to do is come back in here and I'm going to comment this out so it's being ignored. So later at the very end, I will take out this comment so it'll actually save it. But for now, I just want it to be ignored. That way I don't have to keep deleting out configurations to get back to where I was originally. So now at this point, we have everything we need, and let's click run. Okay, go back here and we see that the model annotations were indeed added. Now you might be thinking, wait, why were they added? Was one of the drawing views selected in that case? Well, yes, in fact, after this method ran, the drawing views by default are selected. However, just to make things interesting, just so you can learn a little bit more about the API, let's assume that one of the drawing views was not selected, and so we actually do need to include a line in our code that selects one of the drawing views. How would we do that? Well, there's a basic rule for selection in the API that we can follow. If whatever you are trying to select is listed in the feature manager tree, then you can use an API call, and if you want you can stop and try to search for it if you'd like, but it's going to be select by ID 2. And you might have ran into this just by typing in some topics related to selection. You might have eventually come across this, and it says selects the specified entity. And notice it's part of iModelDoc extension. I'll explain what that means more in a moment. It's not a big deal though. If we move down to the parameters section, you're going to see that there's a lot of notes, but then also in the remarks section there's a lot of remarks. That's because this method has a lot of caveats. But the biggest one is the one I just told you about. It's the basic rule of thumb I suggest before you use this method. Again, it is whatever I'm trying to select in the feature manager tree, and in our case we'll just go ahead and select drawing view 1, and that is in the feature tree, so we should be okay. So how do we use this? Well, first of all, it is part of iModelDoc extension, so we need access to this interface, whatever it is. So what is iModelDoc extension? Well, basically, if we go back to iModelDoc 2 and take a look at the members list, here's what's going on. There is actually a limit within Visual Basic for applications for the number of members you can have in a single interface. I think it's something like 1024. So this is a very huge list, and what happened as they were developing the API is that they ran out of room. They went beyond that allowable number. So they needed another interface that is basically identical to iModelDoc 2, but lets them include more members. And that is what iModelDoc extension is. So notice it says the same thing as iModelDoc 2, allows access to the model, and if we click on the members page, this is basically just more functionality that iModelDoc 2 can perform. And in our case, it happens that select by ID 2 is found within iModelDoc extension and not iModelDoc 2. So how do we get to iModelDoc extension? I'm just going to show you a quick trick right now. First of all, let's go back up here, and we want to select the drawing view before we insert model dimensions. So let's say select drawing view, and what we're going to do is we're going to type in SW model just as though we were using this variable up here, but we're not declaring anything related to iModelDoc extension. Instead, what we're going to do is hit dot. I'm going to type in extension, and then I'm going to hit dot again, and right there I now have access to everything within iModelDoc extension. So very nice shortcut that prevents you from having to declare a whole new variable. So now let's type in select by ID 2, and let's take a look at the parameters for this. Go back to the select by ID 2 page, and for the first parameter is name, the name of the object to select, or an empty string. So in our case we're going to put in drawing view 1 because that's the name of the object we want to select. Then for type, we're going to go in here, and this is a huge list. This is basically a list of everything you can select in SOLIDWORKS. And what I recommend you do here is just hit Control F, type in some keywords. So I typed in view, and it took me to SW cell drawing views. However, this isn't actually what I want to include for select by ID 2. So instead, what I want to do is keep going even further down this list, and in the remarks section it says iModelDoc extension select by ID 2 string. So we know that what we're looking for is SW cell drawing views. So right there's the enumeration member we looked at above, but then right here is the actual string that we're supposed to include with select by ID 2. So let's go ahead and copy that now. And the first parameter is the string, so drawing view 1, and then type, we're just going to do that. And then we need an X, Y, and Z value. So this is if you're selecting something by its location on the screen. However, in our case, since it resides in the feature manager tree, it's actually enough for us to just specify the name and the type. And so we don't even have to worry about the location. So you can actually put in whatever you want here. It doesn't matter. I can just put in 000, and it'll basically look at these two guys and realize, all right, that's enough information for me to find it, and then it's just going to ignore the rest. So that's good enough for our purposes. I would also note that it is a little bit dangerous trying to use this API call to select things by location on the screen, because you're making that huge assumption that that object is always going to be in that location. So for example, if you're trying to select a face I would not recommend using this API call at all. There are API calls specific to objects like iFace2 that you would use to select faces or vertices or edges or bodies or just other things out in the display area. So that's going definitely beyond the depth of what I want to cover here, but I just wanted to note that this isn't a one-size-fits-all API call. So next up, what are we working with? Let's go back in the API help and take a look. And we are now to the append argument. So if you put in a true, it means it's going to select that thing and then also keep all previous selections selected. But if you put in false, it's basically going to clear all the selections and then only select the thing you now want to select. Hope that made some sense. If you want, just try playing with it, turn on true versus false, and you'll see the difference if you already have something selected. In one case, it'll deselect the other thing, and in the other case, it'll keep it selected. So let's go back in here to our code, and I'm going to just say false. That way the current selection list is wiped out. Mark as long. I'm not going to explain to you what marks are. For right now, you just need to know that you can put in 0. And then this is interesting, callout as callout. Let's go back to the API help. Pointer to the associated callout. What does all that mean? Well, if I click in callout, here it's taking us to a new interface. Do I have to learn all about this new interface then and implement that? No, you don't. We're actually just going to ignore it. And earlier I mentioned that if you're trying to ignore an argument that's requiring an object, then you don't put empty, you put nothing. So we're going to type nothing here in a moment. But I also want to note that when in the API help it says pointer, so it'll say something like gets a pointer to, or retrieve the pointer, something like that. It's basically just saying get the interface. So this is basically saying specify an iCallout interface. So when you see pointer, just think interface or object. Okay, so back here for callout, we're just going to put in nothing just like that. And now I'm going to look and see what select option is. Selection option as defined in here, default or extensive. Well, I don't even know the difference between those two, but I see that default is 0, and that's probably what I want, so I'm just going to put that in 0. And now we're done. So let's go ahead and save this and try running it one more time and just make sure that everything is working okay. And I should be able to rebuild this, and it will let me rebuild it because I removed that line in which it was saving it. Up here, I took that out. So let's run this, and it looks like it is input everything. And notice that the alignment of the dimensions, it's not perfect. You might want to go in here and do a little bit more rearranging, but it's definitely a lot better than if you had the last argument of insert model annotations 3 set to true. And if you want, you can go down here, set this to true, and see what result you get. And I think you'll find that you like false a lot better.